She stood at the edge of the Ashmore Winter Assembly, with her hands folded in front of her plain gray gown, and the certainty, arriving with the cold clarity of something long expected, that tonight was the night her uncle would announce the thing she had been dreading since October. The room smelled of beeswax and cedar, and the faint particular warmth of too many bodies pressed into a space designed to impress rather than comfort. Chandeliers threw their light down in generous, indifferent abundance, gilding the silk of Miss Arabella Finch's ivory gown, and the heavy pearls at Lady Dorothea Vance's throat, and the worn hem of Cecily Hartwell's only presentable dress with precise equality, as though the light itself had not been informed of the distinctions it was meant to honor. And then the crowd moved. Not all at once, not with announcement, but in that particular unconscious way a room responds to a person whose authority it has long ago internalized. The Duke of Ashmore crossed the floor in 3 measured strides, and every head turned, and the musicians lost half a beat, and Lady Dorothea's fan arrested mid-motion, and Cecily felt her heart make one hard knock against her ribs, because she had seen that walk before. She had seen it when she did not know whose walk it was. She had seen it in April, in the first assembly of the season, in a ballroom lit for spring, when she had spoken without thinking to a man she believed was a stranger, and said every honest thing she thought. He was walking toward her. What she did not yet know, standing at the edge of the Ashmore Winter Assembly in her gray gown with £4,000 of her uncle's debt pressing against her ribs, was that he had been walking toward her since April. The season had opened with the usual ceremonies of assessment. Cecily had arrived in London on the 3rd day of April, 23 years old, her father 3 years in the ground, her uncle Gerald Hartwell's hand at her elbow, and his debts a weight she could feel without being told their specific sum. She had learned the sum anyway. £4,000. She had found the solicitor's letter in the library at Hartwell House. Not by prying, but by reaching for a volume of natural history and finding the envelope loose behind it, as though Gerald had shelved it there the way one shelves a thing one cannot bear to look at directly. She had read it twice, replaced it exactly, and said nothing, because saying nothing was the skill her circumstances had most thoroughly developed in her. Her gown for the first assembly of April was 3 years old and had been remade twice. The lace at the collar was her mother's, detached from a dress that had itself been unmade for parts when the bills came in the winter after the funeral. The gown was clean and well-fitted, and entirely without the embellishment that every other young woman in the room had managed as a matter of course. Cecily had stood in the receiving line and watched the evening's arithmetic at work. A girl's worth calculated in the cut of her gown and the clarity of her skin and the number of acres attached to her father's name. She possessed a good complexion and no acres, and the kind of face the season had collectively decided not to notice, which suited her precisely as well as it hurt her. Which was to say, it suited her not at all. And she had made her peace with the hurt the way one makes peace with weather. It was Lady Rosalind Fenny, a kind woman of 50 with a daughter newly out, who had introduced her to the man by the terrace door. Lady Rosalind had called him simply Mr. Ashmore, which was either a mistake or a mercy, and Cecily had not heard the correction if one was offered, because the room was loud and she was watching her uncle across the floor make his particular variety of social progress, which involved locating the nearest man of fortune and manufacturing a reason to stand beside him. She had turned back to the man by the terrace door and said, without preamble, and before she could arrest herself, "I find the assembly rather resembles a livestock auction, except that the livestock are expected to smile." She had expected to be reproved, or ignored, or met with the blank, polite blankness that men of station employed when a woman without rank said something inconvenient. She had received none of those responses. He had looked at her for a long moment with gray eyes that gave nothing away, and then he had said, very quietly, "And do you smile, Miss Hartwell?" It was not a question. She had noticed that. She had said, "When I have genuine cause." I try not to manufacture the expression. He had said nothing further. The conversation had ended in a way that felt, to Cecily, like a door closing on a room she had not realized she wanted to enter. She had moved away, and Lord Fenny had claimed his wife's attention. And the evening had continued its loud, indifferent progress around her. And she had not thought about the man by the terrace door again. Or rather, she had thought about him with the frequency of someone who was making a deliberate effort not to. She had learned his name the following morning at breakfast, when Gerald read aloud from the society column with the focused attention he gave to any text that mentioned property and title in proximity. Edmund Vance, the Duke of Ashmore, had been observed at the season's first assembly, presumably evaluating the field. Miss Arabella Finch was mentioned in the same paragraph. So was a fortune of unspecified size, and 2 estates in Wiltshire, one of which, Ashmore Park, occupied 40,000 acres of particularly productive land. Cecily had set down her teacup very carefully. Gerald had not noticed her stillness. Gerald rarely noticed things that were not denominated in pounds sterling or expressed in the form of a social opportunity. If she had known that night who she was speaking to, she would have said nothing at all. She would have stood at the edge of the terrace door in her remade gown and manufactured the expression he had asked about, and the evening would have been exactly as empty as every other. This thought arrived later, in the privacy of her small room at Hartwell House, and it arrived with a grief she could not entirely account for. Lady Dorothea Vance had noticed Cecily at the second assembly of April, which is to say she had noticed her in the particular way a woman notices an object that is in the wrong place. The dowager was not an unkind woman by her own accounting. She was a woman whose entire inner architecture had been built around the understanding that the world had an order, that the order served a function, and that her son's marriage was the most important brick in a particular wall she had been constructing for 20 years. She had said to Mrs. Adeline Morrow, who was standing beside her at the second assembly, "The Hartwell girl, Gerald's niece. Rather a shame, isn't it? Provincial, no fortune, no prospects, the sort of girl who doesn't know she's already lost." Mrs. Morrow had agreed, because Mrs. Morrow agreed with Lady Dorothea on principle, the way one agrees with weather. Cecily had not heard it. A footman had, and the footman had a daughter who worked in the Hartwell kitchen, and by Tuesday the observation had made its circuit. The kitchen maid had not meant to let it reach Cecily. These things reached Cecily anyway, because truth is persistent, and because Cecily had long since learned to read the way a room adjusted its expression when she walked into it. Provincial. No fortune. The sort of girl who does not know she is already lost. She had held the words for a day, and then she had set them down in the way one sets down something heavy that one has been carrying unnecessarily, except that one always picks it up again at 3 a.m. when the house is quiet. Edmund Vance had appeared at the third assembly in a way that the room experienced as a meteorological event. He was 6 feet tall, which was not remarkable, and he was the possessor of a fortune and a title and an estate the size of a small county, which was moderately remarkable. But the quality that made the room adjust was something else entirely, something Cecily would have described, had she been asked and had she trusted herself to answer, as an earned stillness. The stillness of a person who has paid for his composure and knows exactly what it cost. She had not spoken to him again. She had watched him from a careful distance, in the way one watches something one has decided is not one's concern, and she had noticed the way Arabella Finch arranged herself in his vicinity with the practiced ease of a woman who had been told her entire life that she was the correct answer to every question a man of his rank might ask. She had also noticed, and filed without interpretation, that his eyes had found her twice across the third assembly, and once across the fourth, and that each time he had looked away before she could decide what the look meant. The Ashmore estate sat 12 miles outside London and maintained, as great houses did, a particular self-contained gravity that required a specific occasion to penetrate. Cecily had been granted such an occasion in the second week of May, when Lady Rosalind Fenny, whose daughter Charlotte was by then in the tentative early stages of some correspondence with Ashmore's land steward, had arranged a small party to view the grounds. Gerald had agreed with such rapidity that Cecily understood the invitation had been sought rather than received. Ashmore Park in May was the kind of house that answered a question you had not known you were asking. The stone was old and pale and certain of itself. The formal gardens had been allowed, in places, to soften at their edges, as though whoever kept them had decided that perfect containment was a more accurate image of human aspiration than of human life. Thomas had been in the garden when they arrived. He was 9 years old and small for it, and sitting on a stone bench at the garden's far edge, with the fixed, concentrated stillness of a child who has learned that stillness is a form of self-protection. He did not look up when the party arrived. He did not look up when the housekeeper, Mrs. Nora Pembe, came out to receive them with a warmth that spoke of genuine care for the house and its inhabitants. He did not look up when Arabella exclaimed about the roses. Cecily had looked at him for a long moment, and then she had crossed the garden to the stone bench and sat down beside him with 3 feet of careful distance between them, and said nothing at all. After a time, Thomas had said, without looking at her, "You're not going to ask me why I'm not with the others." She had said, "No." He had been quiet for another moment. Then, "Everyone asks." "I expect they mean well," she had said. "People often ask questions they think are kind before they've considered whether the question is useful." He had turned his head then and looked at her, 9 years old and gray-eyed, and wearing, Cecily thought, the particular expression of a child who has been told a great many comfortable untruths and has arrived at a furious private knowledge of what they are. He had asked with the bluntness that children use when they have decided to trust someone for exactly 1 minute and want their money's worth, "Is my father coming back?" Every adult at Ashmore Park had been asked this question. Every adult at Ashmore Park had answered it with a version of soon, or perhaps, or we must hope and pray, which were lies of varying gentleness and identical cruelty. Cecily had known this the way she knew most things, which is to say, from the look on the housekeeper's face when the boy's name was said in certain company. She had said, "No. Your father died 2 winters ago in a riding accident in Spain. Your Uncle Edmund will have told you that he was a brave man who loved you. I expect that is true. I expect it is also not enough." Thomas had been very quiet. Then his chin had done a thing that 9-year-old chins do when they are deciding whether to cry, and he had decided not to. And he had said, "Nobody said it like that before." "Probably they were frightened of hurting you," she had said. "The truth does hurt sometimes, but it is less heavy to carry than a hope that has nowhere to go." She had not known Edmund was there. She had not known he had come down from the house and taken a position near the garden gate, where the old stone wall offered a shadow, and had stood very still, and watched his ward's face while Cecily Hartwell said the words no one else had been willing to say. She had not known that Thomas, for the first time in 2 years, had leaned very slightly sideways on the bench, closing the 3 feet of careful distance between them by half, Edmund had stood at the garden gate for a long time after Cecily rose and returned to the party. He had stood there long enough that his hands, which he had pressed flat against the stone wall, left an impression in the moss that Mrs. Pembe found the following morning and could not quite account for. He told himself, in the weeks that followed, that what he had witnessed in the garden was simply a young woman of unusual directness speaking honestly to a child. He was a man who valued directness. He valued it because his brother George had been indirect about the debt he had accumulated in Edmund's name, and about the transactions he had made on Edmund's behalf, and about the series of decisions that had brought him to Spain in the autumn of 2 years ago, and indirect about all of it until the letter had arrived with the news that there was no longer anything to be indirect about. George had left Thomas. George had left Ashmore Park and the entails complications, and Thomas, who was 9, and who would not eat, and who sat alone on stone benches. And Edmund had spent 2 years trying to reach the boy, and not knowing which words to use, because his own grief had eaten the vocabulary for it. He had not gone to the stone bench himself after Cecily rose. He had gone back into the house and found the afternoon's conversation managed and his mother's approval of Miss Arabella Finch expressed with increasing specificity, and he had said very little, which was his habitual mode, and watched Cecily Hartwell across the drawing-room collect her gloves from the chair where she had left them, and speak quietly to Charlotte Fenney about the roses, and he had thought, with the precision of a man who has not permitted himself to think such things in some time, that she was not in the least ordinary. He had said nothing. He said nothing across May and into June, because he was the Duke of Ashmore, and he had been taught that certainty precedes declaration, and because he was not yet certain, except in the body's private reckoning, which he had not yet decided to trust. If you find yourself moved by Cecily's particular kind of courage, the quiet, costly kind that costs the most because no one is watching, leave a comment below. These stories exist because you choose to hear them through to the end. Lady Dorothea escalated in July, as a season's pressures tend to escalate, when the mathematics of the assembly circuit began to resolve toward outcomes. She had arranged 3 separate occasions on which Arabella Finch and Edmund occupied the same evening's proximity, and Edmund had been politely present at all 3 and had said nothing that a careful listener could denominate as encouragement. This had alarmed Dorothea in the low, controlled way of a woman who trusts her own judgment absolutely, and therefore finds its apparent failure difficult to process. At the morrow dinner in the 2nd week of July, she had said to her own reflection in the window glass, in the presence of 3 women who would carry the observation faithfully, "Gerald Hartwell's niece has apparently decided that the season is a place for her opinions. Poor girl. Provincial to the last. One does hope she'll find her level before she embarrasses herself entirely." Cecily had heard this one directly, from Charlotte Fenney, who had told her in the hall outside the dining room, with the apologetic distress of a kind person delivering bad news. Cecily had thanked her. She had gone back into the dining room and finished her soup, and said 3 unremarkable things to the gentleman at her left, and felt somewhere beneath her ribs the familiar weight of the words settling in to sit beside the others. Provincial. Poor girl. Has apparently decided the season is a place for her opinions. She had decided that evening that the words were not wrong exactly. She was from the country. She had no fortune. She did have opinions, and she had expressed them. And the only court in which that had cost her anything worth grieving was the one presided over by a man whose gray eyes had found her 4 times across 4 assemblies, and whose name she was not permitted to think about with any seriousness. She thought about him with considerable seriousness. Gerald Hartwell signed the conditional engagement on the 21st of August. Cecily learned of it on the 22nd from a letter left on her dressing table in the hand of Gerald's solicitor, because Gerald himself had gone to his club and was not expected back until evening. The engagement was to Mr. Francis Crail, the second son of a creditor to whom Gerald owed, among other things, the majority of the £4,000. The engagement was conditional upon Cecily's signature, which the solicitor noted would be required before the 1st of October to give the arrangement legal standing. She sat on the edge of the bed and read it twice, and then she sat for a long time with the letter in her lap and considered the horizon available to her. She knew Francis Crail by sight and by report. He was 29 and had his father's eyes, which were the eyes of a man who calculated. She would have a house in the country. She would have the termination of Gerald's obligation. She would have a life that was technically adequate and personally insupportable. She had until the 1st of October. Lady Dorothea had sent a note of congratulation to Gerald the following morning, which Cecily intercepted by being in the hall when the footman arrived. She did not open it. She did not need to. The note's existence was sufficient commentary. The label had landed a third time, but this time it landed in the form of the season's verdict made procedural. The girl without prospects had found her correct level. She sat at the small writing desk in her room on the 23rd of August and wrote a letter. She was not certain, then or later, that she had made the right decision in writing it. She was certain that she had reached the end of the horizon available to silence, and that there was a specific thing she had observed across the course of 5 months that needed to be said aloud to the person it concerned, and that if she was to be consigned to Francis Crail's adequacy before October, she would not go there without having said it. She wrote to Edmund Vance, Duke of Ashmore. She told him that she had watched him look at Thomas across dinner twice in June, and she had seen, on both occasions, a man who was trying to find the door of a room he did not know how to enter. She told him that Thomas was not a locked room. She told him that the boy needed someone to sit with the truth of his father's death, the way she had sat with it on the bench in May, without ornamentation and without comfort, that cost nothing, and that Edmund was the only person in the boy's life with the necessary standing and the necessary grief to be believed. She told him that the distance in his eyes when he looked at Thomas was not coldness. She had observed coldness in men of rank across the entirety of this season. What she had observed in Edmund Vance was something else. A man who was afraid of causing pain so precisely the same shape as a pain he had already caused. She did not tell him she was to be engaged to Francis Crail. She did not ask him for anything. She sealed the letter and posted it, and spent the following week in a state of suspended quiet that felt, she thought, remarkably like the feeling of having spoken honestly without expecting to be heard. The Ashmore Winter Assembly was held on the 12th of November. Gerald had confirmed attendance with a confidence that told Cecily he had communicated to Lady Dorothea the progress of the arrangement with Francis Crail, and that Lady Dorothea had found the confirmation satisfactory enough to include them on the Assembly's list. Cecily had dressed in the gray gown and repaired the left cuff's tear, and thought, with the steady application of will she had cultivated across 23 years of practice, that she would endure the evening with whatever dignity the evening permitted. She had not received a reply to her letter. She had not expected one. She had written it for the same reason one sets down a heavy thing, not because the setting down resolves the weight, but because the act of setting it down is the only honest response available. The assembly was crowded and warm and full of the particular energy of a room that has spent an entire season in accumulation and is now cashing its social notes. Arabella Finch was in ivory silk with a diamond at her throat, precisely as suited to this room as it was possible to be. Gerald had found his way to a knot of men near the card room within 7 minutes of arrival. Mrs. Pembe had come with the Ashmore household's party in the dual capacity of senior housekeeper and woman, whose presence at assemblies was understood to be Edmund's private acknowledgement that the household was a family, rather than a set of rooms with functions. Cecily had not known that. She had only known Mrs. Pembe from the visit in May. From the way the woman had moved through the house with the warmth of someone who had tended it across decades and believed in what it held. Lady Dorothea had located Cecily within the first quarter hour. She had come with Arabella at her side and her fan at its customary measured height, and she had said, in the carrying voice of a woman who intends to be heard, "Miss Hartwell, how good of your uncle to bring you this evening." One did wonder, given the news. The room nearest them had listened. The room nearest them was the room that mattered, being composed of the senior members of 3 families whose social architecture interconnected with the season's primary circuits. Cecily had said, "Good evening, Lady Dorothea." "The Crail engagement," Dorothea had said, her voice carrying the particular gentleness of a correction delivered with complete confidence. "I understand the arrangement is in progress. A suitable resolution for a girl in your position. Frances Crail is not the worst match. Provincial girls have done with less." And then the crowd had moved. Cecily had felt it before she saw it. The particular atmospheric shift of a room reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity. She had turned, and Edmund was crossing the floor. And he was not walking toward Arabella Finch. And he was not walking toward his mother. And the 3 feet of open floor the assembly made for him on reflex were aimed, with geometric precision, at the point where she was standing. He stopped at a distance of 4 feet. He looked at Dorothea for exactly 1 second, and in that second something passed between them that Cecily could not name, a communication carried entirely in the quality of his stillness. Then he looked at Cecily. He said, "I received your letter." The assembly room held its breath. He said, "You wrote to me that the distance in my eyes when I looked at Thomas was not coldness. You wrote that you had observed coldness in men of rank across the entirety of this season." His voice was very level. It carried without volume, the way his authority had always carried. "You were the only person across the entirety of this season who looked at me precisely long enough and precisely carefully enough to see the difference." Lady Dorothea said, "Edmund?" He said, not turning, "Madam, I ask you to be quiet for a moment." Dorothea was quiet. It was, by her own later reckoning, not the most comfortable moment of her life. He said to Cecily, "You also wrote that I was the only person in Thomas's life with the necessary standing and the necessary grief to be believed. I have been in my brother's house 2 days since receiving that letter. Thomas played 3 bars of a German air on the piano yesterday morning. He has not touched the piano in 2 years." Cecily's throat was doing something she could not control, which was to close around a feeling she had not prepared herself for. He said, "I understand there is a conditional arrangement being proposed for your hand. I understand it requires your signature, and that you have not signed it." He had turned, fractionally, toward Gerald Hartwell, who had materialized at the edge of the group, with the specific expression of a man calculating at speed. "My solicitor is present this evening, Mr. Hartwell. The arrangement with Frances Crail will be discharged. The £4,000 will be retired. The condition on which those things proceed is that your niece is not asked to sign anything she has not chosen freely." Gerald said, after a pause that was not quite long enough to be defiant, "Your Grace." Edmund turned back to Cecily. He said very quietly, so that the room had to lean in to hear it, "The first assembly of April. You said the season resembled a livestock auction, except that the livestock were expected to smile. I have thought about that sentence more times across the last 7 months than I can account for, with any satisfying logic," she said, because her voice had apparently decided to operate independently of her composure. "I should not have said it." "You should have said it," he said. It was true. It is the sort of truth that a person who has decided not to manufacture expressions would say. The corner of his mouth moved, very slightly, in something that was almost not there, and was, nevertheless, unmistakably present. "I find that I would prefer to hear the rest of your honest thoughts, Miss Hartwell. All of them. For as long as the supply holds." The room breathed out. Lady Dorothea Vance, to her credit and to her son's later private acknowledgment of it, did not make a scene. She had the particular constitution of a woman whose confidence has been organized around her judgment of people, and she had, across the preceding 7 months, been building a case she was now required to admit had been built on the wrong site. She looked at Cecily Hartwell in her gray gown, with the repaired cuff and the mother's lace at the collar, and she saw, with the slow, uncomfortable clarity of a mind that is honest under sufficient pressure, that the girl had not been lost at all. She said nothing. The saying of nothing was, for Lady Dorothea, the most significant speech of the evening. Arabella Finch had turned, early in Edmund's crossing of the floor, and had understood with the rapid, comprehensive intelligence she had always possessed, but rarely needed to employ, that she was watching a decision that had already been made. She had absorbed this with the grace available to a woman who has been told all her life that she was the correct answer, and who is discovering, in one particular cold November room, that there is a question her preparation did not address. She left the assembly before the supper hour, and her exit was noticed, and no one spoke unkindly of it because nothing was required except the noting. Mr. Aldous Hearne, Edmund's solicitor, had been present at the assembly in the specific capacity of a man whose presence is a form of evidence. He had confirmed, when Gerald Hartwell asked, that the conditional engagement held no legal standing without Cecily's signature. He had confirmed the sum of £4,000 as the debt to be retired. He had confirmed the terms with the directness of a man whose vocabulary was entirely procedural and entirely sufficient, and Gerald Hartwell had listened to all of it with the look of a man doing arithmetic that persistently fails to produce a preferred result. What it produced instead was the resignation of a man who has been offering a lesser thing, and has been shown, with complete clarity, what the better thing looks like. Gerald retired the conditional engagement before the supper hour. He went to the card room afterward, and Cecily was reasonably certain he went to lose the £4,000 worth of relief in a more familiar kind of gamble. But that was Gerald's business, and was no longer hers to carry. Mrs. Pembe found Cecily near the window during supper, in the way that women find each other at assemblies when neither has the patience for the assembly's formal circuits. She said, with the unceremonious warmth of a woman whose household was a second self, "The boy asked about you last week. He asked if the lady from the garden was coming back." She paused. "I told him I rather thought she might." Outside the window, Cecily could see that it was snowing, the first snow of November, which the season had not promised and the evening had not forecast, was coming down in the particular way of the first snow, which is to say with the quiet insistence of something that has been waiting. She thought about Thomas at the piano, 3 bars of a German air. She thought about the stone bench in May and the boy's chin making its decision. And she thought about a man who had stood at a garden gate long enough to leave marks in the moss, and who had crossed a room full of witnesses to name a sentence she had said without thinking, and who had looked at her in the moment before the room breathed out, with the particular expression of a person who has located, at some cost and after considerable searching, a room he did not know existed and is not prepared to walk away from. The winter at Ashmore Park was long and specific in the way that all good things are long and specific, which is to say it required patience and returned interest. Lady Dorothea came in December, as she always came to Ashmore for December, and she came into the morning room on the third day of her visit, and found Cecily reading aloud to Thomas from a natural history of birds, while Thomas ate his breakfast with one hand and held a pencil in the other, and drew, in the margin of a notebook, what were either small finches or significant smudges. Dorothea stood in the doorway for a long moment. She said nothing. She crossed to the chair nearest the fire and sat down and picked up her needlework. And Thomas said, without looking up, "She knows all the birds, grandmother." And Dorothea said, with only a slight adjustment of her customary register, "So I hear." It was not warmth yet. It was the absence of cold in a room that had been cold for a long time, and absence of cold is, in its own way, a form of warmth. And both Cecily and Dorothea were honest enough to accept the smaller version, while the larger one was still in progress. Edmund said, on the 21st of December, in the library at Ashmore Park, with snow coming down outside the tall windows and the fire going well, and no one else present. Thomas asked me this morning if you would teach him to play the piano. Cecily said, "I am not a particularly accomplished pianist." He said, "I know. I asked Mrs. Pembe. She said you were honest about it, and that Thomas said he didn't care about accomplished. He wanted someone who would sit beside him while he found the notes." She was quiet for a moment, with the quality of quiet that is not absence but presence reconsidered. She said, "He is rather a wise child." "He has had," Edmund said, "a good teacher this autumn." He was looking at her with the gray eyes that had found her 4 times across the season's assemblies, and that she had spent 7 months refusing to interpret. And she was looking back at him, and neither of them was manufacturing any expression at all. He moved to the chair beside hers, which was close, and the fire was warm. And the snow outside the window was the second snow of December, and was coming down with the same quiet insistence as the first, as though the weather had decided it had a point to make, and intended to make it thoroughly. He said, "The sentence you spoke in April, about the livestock and the smile." He was not quite looking at her. He was looking at the fire. "I have not stopped thinking about it because it was witty, though it was. I have not stopped thinking about it because it was accurate, though it was that also." A pause, the kind of pause that a man who has long preferred silence uses to locate the particular word he has not needed before. "I have not stopped thinking about it because it was the first honest thing anyone said to me in 2 years, without knowing who I was, or what the saying might cost them. It was simply true. You said it because it was true." She said, "I would have not said it if I had known." He turned his head and looked at her. "I know," he said. "That is rather the point." She thought about that. She thought about a man who had spent 2 years in rooms where everything said to him had been calibrated against his title and his fortune and his capacity to be useful, and who had stood by a terrace door in April and heard a young woman in a remade gown say a true thing to a stranger, and had known immediately, in the body's plain reckoning, what the value of that was. She thought about Thomas at the piano. 3 bars of a German air, offered not as performance, but as tentative return. She thought about Mrs. Pembe saying the boy had asked if the lady from the garden was coming back, and the confidence with which she had said she rather thought she might. She said, "I will teach him. I will be honest about my limitations with the instrument, which are significant. I will sit beside him while he finds the notes." Edmund said, "Yes." And then, after a moment, with the quality of precision he brought to every declaration worth making. Stay. Not only for Thomas. It was the right number of words. She had understood for some time that he was a man who used the right number of words and no others, and that the no others was where most of his meaning lived. She said, yes. By Christmas, Thomas had 7 bars of the German air under his fingers and was working toward 12 with the focused determination of a child who has found a reason to sit at the piano rather than a reason to be directed to it. Cecily sat beside him on the bench and said encouraging things that were also true, which was the only kind of encouraging thing she knew how to say. And Thomas tolerated the praise with the suspicious dignity of a boy who has been lied to and is now calibrating carefully who he believes. He believed Cecily. He had decided this in November, from a distance, and had confirmed it by December. And by Christmas, he had confirmed it with the completeness of a 9-year-old who does not half commit. Mrs. Pembe brought them tea at 11 o'clock on Christmas morning and found them both at the piano, and Thomas had played his 12 bars without stopping. And Cecily had said, quite honestly, that was considerably better than yesterday. And Thomas had accepted this as the highest available praise because it was specific and it was true. Edmund stood in the doorway with his tea and watched, and he did not press flat against any stone walls, and he did not manufacture any expressions, and the feeling in him was one he had not had occasion to name for some time, which is to say it was warmth without qualification, the kind that comes after cold has lasted long enough that the body has forgotten. Warmth is a permanent possibility, and then is reminded by something specific and unlooked for, and true. The snow came down outside the music room window with the quiet persistence of something that has found where it belongs and intends to stay. Thomas played the 12th bar, and then, without fanfare, continued into the 13th, which no one had heard from him before, and Cecily said nothing, and waited. And the note rang out into the warm room like the first honest thing said without knowing it would be heard. And it was. If Cecily's story stayed with you this evening, leave a word in the comments. These voices carry further when you choose to carry them with you.